Hello to all my DIY mechanics. In this video I'll show you how to replace the wheel bearings or the brake discs and wheel bearings on your Renault Traifc, identical in construction to the Opel Vivaro and the Nissan Primastar, because the wheel bearings on these models are pressed into the rear brake discs, which means you always have to replace both, or it's easier to replace both. Be sure to stay tuned until the end, because I'll tell you about important mistakes you should avoid. And yes, I'm speaking from experience, because I made the mistake the first time I replaced them, and then the brakes started to smoke, the wheel bearing seized up, and now I have to do the whole thing again. Great. So be sure to stay tuned if you want to avoid making the same mistake. Just a quick note in advance that this video is only intended as a guide and is not a manual. I'm not liable for damage to the vehicle nor injuries. First of all, jack up the car and secure it against rolling away. You should also not only work with a jack, but also place a jack stand underneath for safety, because you have to use a relatively large amount of force on a long lever to loosen the centering screw. Once the car is safely jacked up, the brake caliper can be removed. To do this, loosen the two bolts here at the top and at the bottom. They might be a bit tight, so I like to use a rubber hammer and a ratchet, and so far I've been able to loosen every screw on the brake caliper. And because I recently replaced the brake caliper, I was able to unscrew the bolts by hand after loosening them. If this isn't so easy for you and the inner part turns with it, then you can use an open-end wrench to counter it. Once the screws are out, the brake caliper can be easily removed. Be careful that the brake pads don't fall out, at least if you want to reuse them again. And the brake caliper shouldn't just hang on the brake line, but put it somewhere so that there's no tension on the brake line. Next, the brake caliper bracket must be removed. It is secured with two screws, one at the top and one at the bottom. Once you have unscrewed them, the bracket can be removed. The brake caliper bracket needs to be prepared for the new brake pads, so that they slide smoothly and don't get stuck. In my case, you can see clearly the white spots where the ceramic paste was, and that needs to be cleaned thoroughly. A wire brush is suitable for this, either by hand or with a cordless drill. Or if there are larger areas of rust, a metal file can also be used to make everything nice and smooth again. You can also test whether the brake pad is running smoothly. Now, you should check whether these sliding sleeves move smoothly. They tend to seize up when moisture gets in, and then the brake caliper can no longer move on the bracket, which leads to the brake always being a bit applied, and because it's not retracting enough. In my case, the sliding sleeves were still okay. However, the sleeves were included with the new brake caliper, so I'll be replacing those too. If you want to see the video how to replace the brake caliper and these sleeves in detail, I'll link it in the video description. Now for the brake disc. It is held in place by a 36mm nut, which is quite tight, so you need a good socket and a long lever. Do not use a normal ratchet for this, because it will break with the high force. And yes, also that happened to me, so something like this stiff handle here and then a really good extensions should do the case. And of course make sure the socket is sitting on the nut correctly, so that it doesn't slip and the nut turns round. Well, and then it should actually come off. And once the nut is unscrewed, the brake disc with wheel bearing can be easily removed from the axle. And before you install the new brake disc with wheel bearing, it's very important that the contact surfaces are all super clean. No rust residue, no dirt, no grime, nothing at all should be on there. And that was the problem for me the first time. I didn't know it better and didn't pay much attention to it, and then the wheel bearing wasn't sitting flat, and then within the first few kilometers you could almost say it broke again. And now of course I had to do the whole thing over again, which is very annoying. But as I said, that's why I am now expressly pointing out that you really should take your time with a wire brush again, and also I used a metal file to help with the burr on the edge of the mount where there was some rust, but of course you have to be careful not to remove too much material, otherwise you could change the mount again, but it is particularly important to keep it clean. And of course the axle itself. Another good tip is to oil the whole thing a little bit, both on the vehicle side and the new brake disc, the wheel bearing, not the brake disc, so that everything glides smoothly and there is no more rust on there, which is very important. Yes, and when everything is nice and clean, the new wheel bearing with brake disc can be pushed onto the hub, taking great care not to jam anything and make sure that the back is flush. Then first tighten the nut by hand, then tighten the nut on the wheel hub to the correct torque using a torque wrench. This is also very, very important. I didn't do this the first time and maybe overdid it a bit. Yeah, and they don't like that. So in my case it was now 280 Newton meters, which is what the wheel hub needed. Here it's written on the brake disc. I assume that all brake discs and wheel bearings are a bit different, so definitely check what you need. And yes, always check whether everything is turning well and so on, and once it's tightened to the correct torque, it's turning nicely and nothing is crunching and you can't hear anything and it's not wobbling. Yeah, you're almost done. You can now reinstall the brake caliper, but of course only after you've cleaned the contact surfaces and possibly replaced the sliding sleeves, or at least checked them. The torque for this is around 120 to 140 Newton meters. I would say, yeah, just nice and tight. Then you should grease the brake pads on the contact surfaces with a ceramic paste so that they always can slide nicely and don't rust. Then insert the brake pads with the brake pad on the brake disc, of course, but that should be obvious, into the brake caliper bracket. Now the brake caliper can be remounted on the caliper bracket. I have replaced the brake caliper so I don't have to turn the piston back. If you want to use your old brake caliper again but have installed new brake disc and pads, then they are of course thicker and the brake piston may be still pushed out, which means you need a tool to reset the brake piston. Unfortunately, I don't have a video of that because I didn't do it, but there is a tool you can use to clamp the whole thing in place, and then turning it back is actually not really complicated. If you want me to make a video about it, write it in the comments, but as I said, it's actually self-explanatory how to use the tool if you have it in front of you. Again, tighten the screws well, as specified, to around 35 to 50 Newton meters. To tighten it, you will have to use an open-end wrench here on this inner nut, I'll call it. Then you can apply the Newton meters mentioned and the brake caliper will be nice and tight again. Once you've done that, it's always a good idea to check again that the brake caliper is sliding smoothly in the sliding sleeves. In my case it is, and the brake disc also turns beautifully without any grinding. Of course, it only could really grind if you press the brake pedal, so I'll do that now. Start the engine, press the brake pedal and see if anything is leaking, because I have also replaced the brake caliper. Of course, after replacing the brake caliper you have to bleed the brakes, which we will discuss in the other video linked in the video description. If you haven't replaced the brake caliper, you don't have to bleed the brakes, of course. And last but not least, of course, remount the tire tighten it crosswise as you normally would. For steel rims, the tightening torque is approximately 120 Newton meters. And after 50 kilometers, retighten them again in case a bolt has loosened. I would also drive a little more carefully for the first few meters, testing every now and then to see if the brakes really work properly. You should not slam the brake and really heating them up. Instead, brake gently to walking speed every now and then, so to speak, and then the surface area between the brake pad and the brake disc increases, and you should also notice that the braking effect is enhanced. I wish you very much success with the repair, and if you have any further questions, feel free to post them in the comments. I would also be very grateful for a like and a subscription, and then we'll see us next time. Take care, bye.